Okay, so I need you to stay with me for this one because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that you genuinely cannot make up. And I know, everyone says that, but by the time we get to the end of this video, I promise you are going to be sitting there with your mouth open, replaying that last part in your head, wondering how one single anniversary dinner, managed to crack open an entire secret life that my husband had been building behind my back for over 2 years. And the most insane part? He's the one who started it. He's the one who opened the door with a joke. A joke that he thought was so clever, so smooth, that it would just slide right past me. But jokes have a funny way of backfiring, don't they? Especially when the person you're joking about decides to speak. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, because you need to understand who Marcus was before you can understand how far he'd fallen by the time this night happened. Because when I first met Marcus, I genuinely believed I had hit the lottery. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because that's truly how it felt. He was charming in the quiet way, not the loud, look-at-me kind of charming, but the kind where he'd remember that you mentioned 3 weeks ago that your favorite kind of coffee was hazelnut, and he'd just show up one day with a hazelnut latte and say nothing about it. He was thoughtful. He was present. He made me feel like the most important thing in whatever room we were in. And I fell for that. Hard. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, and then got married in this gorgeous outdoor ceremony in September. It was genuinely one of the most beautiful days of my life. I cried during the vows. He cried during the vows. Our families cried. It was real. Or at least, I thought it was. The first couple of years of marriage were good. They weren't perfect, because nothing is perfect. But they were good. We had disagreements like any couple. We had stretches where life felt more like logistics than romance, jobs and bills and errands and trying to figure out who was cooking dinner and who forgot to call the plumber. Normal life stuff. But underneath all of that, I thought we were solid. I thought the foundation was strong. I thought that when things got hard, we were the kind of couple that would lean into each other instead of away. I was wrong about that. I was so deeply, embarrassingly wrong about that. The cracks started showing somewhere around year 3, and the thing about cracks is that at first they look like nothing. They look like a bad week. They look like stress from work. They look like someone just being tired or distracted or going through something that they haven't figured out how to talk about yet. Marcus started coming home late. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed. He started being on his phone more, and not in the obvious panicked way that people in movies do it, but in this casual, almost bored way, like he was just scrolling. But there was an attentiveness to it that felt off to me, like he was waiting for something, like every buzz of that phone meant something specific to him. I brought it up a few times, gently at first, and he always had an explanation. Work was intense. There was a new project. His boss was a nightmare lately. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him and because I didn't have anything concrete, just a feeling that sat in my chest like a stone that I kept trying to convince myself wasn't there. I told myself I was being insecure. I told myself that not every distracted husband is a cheating husband. I told myself to stop projecting and trust the person I had married. And so I pushed the feeling down, and I kept doing that, pushing it down and pushing it down for months. Then came our 5th anniversary. And I want to be really clear about this. I had been looking forward to this anniversary for a while. 5 years felt significant to me. It felt like a milestone worth celebrating in a real way, not just dinner at home, but something special. I made a reservation at this restaurant that we'd been talking about trying for about a year, one of those places that's a little out of our usual budget, but absolutely worth it for a special occasion. I got a new dress. I did my hair. I was genuinely excited, in the way that you get excited when you're trying to hold on to something that you're not fully sure is still there, but you're hoping a nice dinner will remind you both of what it was. Marcus seemed fine that evening. A little quiet, maybe, but I chalked that up to the work stress he'd been complaining about all week. We got to the restaurant. We were seated. We ordered drinks, and things felt okay. Normal. Maybe even a little warm between us. We were talking about old memories, early dating stories, the kind of conversation that anniversaries are made for. And I thought, okay, we're going to be fine. This is what we needed. Just this. Time together, no distractions, no phones on the table. Except then, about halfway through our meal, I noticed someone walking through the restaurant toward us. A woman. She was attractive, put together, wearing a fitted blazer and heels, and she had this energy about her, confident, but also something else underneath it, something almost nervous, almost conflicted. She was walking directly toward our table, and I couldn't figure out why. Because I didn't know her. I had never seen this woman in my life, and yet she was looking at our table with this very deliberate expression, like she had made a decision and she was committed to it. Marcus saw her at almost the exact same moment I did, and I want you to pay very close attention to what happened next, because this is the part that told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. He didn't look confused. He didn't look the way you look when a stranger is walking toward you and you can't figure out why. He looked caught. Just for a split second, one tiny flicker of an expression, before he smoothed his face back out and picked up his wine glass like he was completely unbothered. That flicker lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I saw it. I saw it, and I filed it away. The woman stopped at our table. She looked at me first, just for a moment, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite read. Then she looked at Marcus, and she said his name. Not hello, not excuse me, just his name, in a tone that was very quiet and very controlled. And Marcus, without missing a beat, without any hesitation at all, leaned back in his chair, looked at me with this smirk on his face, and said, "Oh, this is a surprise. Babe, are you going to introduce us? Or should I be asking who this is?" And then he laughed. He actually laughed. Like it was funny. Like it was a joke. He looked at me and said, "What? Is this the boyfriend you've been hiding?" I want to take a moment here to let that land. My husband, at our anniversary dinner, in front of a woman he clearly recognized, looked at me and made a joke implying that I was the one with something to hide, that I was the one who knew this person, that I was the one with a secret. It was so bold that for a second, I actually didn't process it. I just sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, thinking, did he just say that? Is this real? Is he actually doing this right now? The woman didn't laugh. She didn't play along. She stood very still and she looked at Marcus for a long moment, and then she said, very calmly, very clearly, "I think you should tell her who I am, or I will." And that was it. That was the moment the entire table shifted. The entire restaurant felt like it got quieter, even though nobody around us had any idea what was happening. Marcus's smirk didn't disappear immediately. It sort of dissolved. Slowly. Like he was waiting to see if she was bluffing. And when it became clear that she was not bluffing, something in his face went very, very still. I put my fork down. I looked at him. And I said, in the calmest voice I have ever used in my life, "Marcus, who is this?" And the silence that followed that question was one of the loudest things I have ever experienced. Her name was Diana. And Diana was not a random woman who had wandered into our restaurant. Diana was not a coworker, not an old friend, not some distant acquaintance from a past he'd told me about. Diana, as she explained in that quiet, controlled voice, while my husband sat there unable to look at either of us, had been seeing Marcus for the past 2 years. 2 years. She told me they had met at a conference he'd attended for work, the same conference he'd told me was incredibly boring, and that he'd spent most of the time on his laptop in the hotel room. She told me that she had genuinely not known about me for the first several months. She had found out about me when she ran into one of Marcus's coworkers at a coffee shop who mentioned his wife, and that had been the beginning of a very long and very painful unraveling for her too. She hadn't come to the restaurant to cause a scene. She told me that directly. She said she had been thinking about what to do for months, whether to come to me, whether to walk away and let it be, whether to confront him privately. But she had happened to see our reservation on his phone, just by accident, when he'd left it unlocked on her counter one morning, and something in her had snapped. She said she needed me to know. Not to hurt me, she said, but because she felt like I deserved to know the truth, and because she was done being kept in the dark herself. I'm going to be honest with you about what happened inside me in those moments, because I think it matters. I didn't cry. That's the thing that surprised me most about myself. I always thought that if something like this ever happened to me, I would fall apart. I would be inconsolable. I would be the woman in the movie sobbing in a restaurant bathroom. But I wasn't. I was eerily calm. I felt something cold and very clear settle over me, like the emotional equivalent of a glass of ice water. And I felt myself becoming very precise, very focused, very present. I think shock does that to some people. It doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like stillness. I thanked Diana. I actually thanked her. I told her I was sorry that she had been lied to as well, because she had been. She had been deceived just as much as I had, just in a different direction. And whatever complicated feelings I had about her in that moment, which were genuinely complicated, I could see clearly that she was not my enemy. My enemy was sitting right across from me, turning his wine glass around in his hands and still not speaking. I turned to Marcus then, and I asked him a very simple question. I asked him if anything Diana had just said was untrue, and he said nothing for a long time. And then he said, "It's complicated." Those 2 words, "it's complicated." After 5 years of marriage, after 2 years of lying, after sitting there and watching me be blindsided at our anniversary dinner, the best he could offer me was, "It's complicated." I nodded. I picked up my purse. I stood up. I told him to enjoy his dinner. And I walked out of that restaurant. What happened after that night is its own long story, and I'll tell you the parts that matter. I stayed at my sister's house for 2 weeks while I figured out what I wanted to do. Marcus called obsessively for the first 3 days, and then his calls became less frequent, which told me everything I needed to know about how panicked he actually was. He sent long text messages, the kind that are clearly written to make the person sending them feel like they tried, full of explanations and half apologies and phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you," and things between us had gotten so distant, and my personal favorite, I was in a really dark place. I read every single one. I saved every single one. Not because I was thinking about forgiving him, but because I'd learned something about myself that night. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Never throw away anything before you know you don't need it. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to believe that if he was just contrite enough and patient enough, I would eventually come back. I think he genuinely believed that. I think the version of me he had constructed in his head over the years was someone who would be devastated and then desperate and then grateful for the chance to repair things. He didn't understand that I had spent 2 weeks becoming someone quite different from the person who'd walked out of that restaurant. Grief does one of 2 things to people. It either breaks them open in a way that they can't recover from, or it burns everything soft away and leaves something harder underneath. I was very clearly the second kind. The moment that really sealed things for me, The moment that made me stop grieving and start planning was a conversation I had with Diana about 3 weeks after that night. We'd been in contact a few times, carefully, because we both understood that we were navigating something unusual and we were trying to do it with some dignity. And she told me something that Marcus had apparently said to her at some point during their 2 years together. She told me that he had told her I was cold, that I had checked out of the marriage emotionally, that he felt more seen and understood in a few months with her than he had in years with me. And that was it. That was the thing that took the last of the grief and turned it into something else entirely. Not because I believed him. I didn't. But because I recognized it for what it was. The oldest trick in the book. The way someone reframes their betrayal as a response to your failure. He had constructed a story where he was the victim, and I decided, very quietly, that I was going to write the ending to that story myself. I won't walk you through every detail of the divorce process because, honestly, it would take another hour, and also some of it is still, technically, ongoing in terms of the finalization. But I will tell you the highlights, because of the documentation I had gathered, because of the timeline Diana was willing to provide, and because of certain financial decisions Marcus had made during the affair, which his lawyer discovered was significant. The settlement conversation went quite differently than he had apparently expected. He had expected me to be emotional and reactive. I was neither. I had a very good lawyer. I had very clear records, and I had absolutely no interest in being reasonable in the direction of someone who had been unreasonable to me for 2 years. He also, and this is my favorite part, he also lost quite a bit of credibility with several mutual friends when the story came out, because he had apparently told a number of people preemptively that our marriage had been struggling because of me. He had been laying groundwork, seeding the narrative. And then Diana, who owed him absolutely nothing at this point, told the truth to the one person in that mutual social circle who tells everyone everything. Within about 2 weeks, the actual story had completely replaced the one he'd been building. Watching that happen, watching the version of events he had carefully constructed just collapse, was one of the more quietly satisfying things I have ever witnessed. I want to say something here, though, before I wrap this up, because I think it's important and I don't want to skip over it. None of this, the planning, the lawyer, the documentation, the watching his narrative fall apart, none of it felt like victory at the time. People sometimes think that revenge, or justice, or whatever you want to call it, feels triumphant. And maybe sometimes it does. But mostly, it just feels like exhaustion. It feels like something you're doing not because it brings you joy, but because it's the right thing to do for yourself. Because you've decided that you will not be the person who walked out of that restaurant and just disappeared quietly into the pain of it. You will be the person who walked out of that restaurant and figured out what came next. What came next, for me, is still unfolding. I'm not going to pretend I'm completely healed or that some days aren't still heavy. I'm not going to give you the version where I have a perfectly neat resolution and a lesson tied up with a bow. What I will tell you is that I am genuinely okay. And I will tell you that the woman who sat down at that anniversary dinner, the one who was pushing feelings down and telling herself she was being insecure and hoping a nice dinner would fix something that was already broken, she's still part of me, but she's not the whole of me anymore. She learned something. She learned to trust what she feels. She learned to stop waiting for proof before she takes herself seriously. She learned that the voice that says something is wrong is usually right, and that silencing it in the name of keeping the peace is a price too high to pay. And Diana. I want to end with Diana because I think she deserves to be acknowledged properly. She didn't have to come to that restaurant. She didn't have to walk up to our table. She didn't have to say a word. She could have walked away and kept her own pain private and let me go on not knowing. The fact that she didn't, the fact that she chose honesty over comfort, over whatever lingering feelings she had about a man who didn't deserve them is something I have a lot of respect for. We are not close friends. It would be strange to be close friends, but there is a kind of understanding between us that I don't think either of us expected, and that I am quietly grateful for. My husband made a joke at our anniversary dinner. He thought he was being clever. He thought he could redirect the attention, make me the one with something to explain, buy himself just a little more time in a story he'd already lost control of. And instead, the stranger he was trying to use as a prop decided to speak. And when she spoke, she didn't just crack the evening, she cracked the whole thing open, wide enough that the truth could finally get out. And the truth, as uncomfortable and devastating as it was, turned out to be the most useful thing anyone gave me that year. So if you're sitting with a feeling right now, some quiet voice in your chest that keeps telling you something isn't right, I just want to say, listen to it. You don't need proof before you take yourself seriously. You don't need someone else to confirm it before it counts. Trust what you know, because the cost of ignoring it is always higher than the cost of facing it. And the person on the other side of facing it, I can tell you from experience, is someone you're going to be really glad you became. Thank you so much for being here, for watching all the way through this with me. If this story hit you in any kind of way, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you have your own story, drop it in the comments, because this community is built on exactly this. People telling the truth about what happened to them and finding out they're not alone. Subscribe if you're new, because there are more stories coming, and some of them are even wilder than this one. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. The